the different aspects of our lives that take place, again, in different settings with different people in person, those all get compressed into this, flat screen that you're interacting with. There's this expectation and this impetus on people to be always adaptable to updating. In the past, it was if you were, stable and set in your identity and your beliefs and values, that was seen as a good thing, right? It's this idea that even though you're moving through the physical space, people are always aware of the digital world.
Welcome, everybody, back to the program here, Robert Meets World podcast. And today, I mean, I love talking to all my guests, but today this is a very special guest because if you know me, you've talked to me in the real world, or even on potentially some of the podcast episodes we've already covered, I have always this mysterious, brilliant friend that I mention, who she has yet to be named. And I am very thrilled to finally get her as kind of a debut on this program and talking about some of her ideas, because we've been connected for a number of years. And I think you, Shannon, are a philosopher at heart, but you are an academic of rhetoric. And we've been talking for a number of years about these different ideas related to the development of like the smartphone, the persuasiveness of technology, and how inundated our lives have become with these like micro interactions and habit loops and these kinds of things. And so I'm super thrilled to have you on the program today, and I want to chat about the different elements that have gone into both your academic career with the theses that you've written, as well as what you're working on today, which is a prospectus for a book and an idea that's you're hoping to share. So, with that being said, Shannon, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Robert. I'm so happy to be here. I love chatting with you. I love hearing your other podcasts and conversations. So happy to be involved.
Amazing. Well, Shannon, can we start? I just love to anchor people's stories back to the beginning. So can we start with, I suppose, where your academic journey began? Maybe your bachelor's, your master's, and what kind of areas that you were interested in studying, and how your, I guess, philosophy and approach has changed in these ideas that you've been developing over time.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. So I think my interest in rhetoric and kind of the things I'm studying now, it started in my undergrad because I took English literature and rhetoric at the University of Waterloo. And, I got to do a little bit of both. Literature, not so much my thing. I love reading, but not studying it academically. But rhetoric, I started to take some classes in my upper years on, persuasion, advertising, semiotics, like the study of signs and symbols. And I realized, wow, I really enjoy this. This is cool to look beyond or below everyday life and kind of see what these structures are that make it up, right? Things that we take for granted. That's what I was so interested in. And so I ended up doing a master's in critical theory, which, funnily enough, I thought was something that it actually wasn't. So I thought, oh, I like rhetoric. I'll go study rhetoric at this program. It was not a rhetoric program. It was a continental philosophy program, which is very different. So I got a 2-year crash course in continental philosophy, which, just it's still just the question of what is below the surface, why is everyday life the way it is, but from a different perspective, which I am very grateful for. But then after that, I thought, well, I love school so much. Why don't I just do it for another 5 years? So that's when I went back to study actual rhetoric, not pretend other thing that I thought was rhetoric at the University of Waterloo again. And so when I got back to the University of Waterloo with my grounding in continental philosophy, I really started to kind of dig into some of these things that I was really interested in understanding. Well, why is everyday life structured the way it is? And one object that I saw as really being foundational to the way everyday life is structured is the smartphone, right? You can't go outside, you can't go in public without seeing at least one, probably many, in fact, quite possibly everyone you see in public, has one in their hand or is using one. So it became my object to think with for, the 4 or 5 years that I was studying it in my PhD. And so it just became such an interesting point of convergence for lots of other questions that I had about how everyday life kind of functions. And so that's why I kind of picked up on the smartphone to be the thing that I would study in my PhD and now going forward as well.
Mm-hmm. And so I feel this is gonna be such a dumb question, but can you define rhetoric for us? Like, what does that mean to you? Is it the art of persuasion? What is rhetoric?
hmm So also a great question, right? I think most of us in high school or maybe in university had to study rhetoric in some capacity, but it was probably Aristotle's ethos, pathos, logos, like appeals to emotion, appeals to logic, or appeals to authority or, character. And so that is the most foundational definition of rhetoric. That's the one that's been in place for, 2000 plus years. But in the last century, there started to be more interest in rhetoric or persuasion beyond just human to human persuasion. So in ancient Greece, it was, well, we need to learn how to persuade people that I'm right in the court of law, so I will not be ostracized from Athens, right? So it was all about human to human communication, especially in speeches. But more recently, people have started to realize, well, images can be persuasive. So we want to look at how those might change people's opinions or behaviors or ideas. Even more recently, there's been this really interesting turn, or the return to things, it's been called. So it's this turn in rhetoric to study how persuasion can be enacted through things. So either objects, architecture, places, each of these different types of phenomena have rhetorical force in the sense that they have the capacity to persuade. So to answer your original question, rhetoric is the art of persuasion, but it's not the art as in something that only a human can use or can um, study in order to understand how persuasion happens. It's, at least in my opinion, and there still are people who hold to the classical tradition and really focus on classical rhetoric, trope, topoi, those kinds of things. My perception is that rhetoric does occur in every arena of life. So persuasion, not just through humans.
It's almost like the study of the phenomena of persuasion. Would that be a fair characterization?
Yeah, I think so. Definitely. And there's lots of definitions floating around. Like there's one scholar, George Kennedy, he defined it as energy. Like rhetoric is an energetic force. And he also believes that animals could engage in rhetoric and things like that. So I'm not quite so much in the energy capacity kind of vein of thought, but it is definitely interesting to consider. But yeah, persuasion is central. Another way of thinking about it is a turning. So John Mucklebauer developed the idea of heliotropic rhetoric, which is in the same way that sunflowers turn towards the sun.
Mm.
Rhetoric is this turning towards some sort of some force or light that changes someone's perspective, which I think is really beautiful. So
Mm.
lots of different ways to kind of conceptualize how that persuasion occurs. But yeah, at base, it is about persuasion of some kind through something or someone.
hmm And did your interest in studying this phenomenon originate in trying to answer the question of what in our world is persuading us and why? Was it answering those deeper questions?
Yeah, because I mean, when I was looking at everyday life, how it works, there's going to be reasons that people continue to act in the ways that they do, or that innovation takes place in or towards certain ends. What are they? Sometimes they're explicitly stated, right? We want to innovate in this way to make more money or to get more consumers or anything like that. But there's all these other layers of persuasion that take place subconsciously or occur through the structures that we interact with, objects that we engage with. So yeah, I was really interested at looking at the different layers and types of persuasion in everyday life, and that's another reason why the smartphone appealed to me, because it is persuasive on so many levels, from overt, right, the advertisements that you get on your phone, all the way down to the way that it's actually shaped and fits into your hand. That's the persuasive aspect and affordance of the device. So
Like the form factor itself, like you're looking at, I guess, suppose the smartphone from all these layers, like what you're experiencing as the user down to, because what comes in for me as you're describing this phenomenon of persuasion is I'm sort of trying to think about the large perspective. Like, why do we need an art of persuasion? Why would we need to have such a large field, understanding the mechanisms by which we persuade other human beings. And the thought that comes to me is this book, cannot remember the gentleman, his name, but it was The Power of Habit, which talks about the human being as sort of a grab bag of sorts of habit loops, right? We have I think it's like the trigger, or no, it's a stimulus, which has the trigger, which creates a behavioral pattern, which then is rewarded, which then like sort of cycles. And then this loop becomes more and more ingrained in us the more that we sort of interact with it. So like the classic addiction theory is, you take the drug gives you the pleasure, it creates a stimulus, you see the drug, and then you sort of go in this circle. And so as you were describing this persuasion, I'm thinking is part of the art of persuasion, or the phenomenon of persuasion, to try and break those habit loops, or to reinforce those habit loops in some way?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. And this is a kind of a roundabout way of answering it, as I sometimes tend to do. And that is, Aristotle defines rhetoric as understanding the available means of persuasion in any given situation. So for him, it's this awareness of these different, I guess, currents or forces that could be capitalized on. But contrary to his view of rhetoric, there was this group of traveling teachers in ancient Greece called sophists. And the sophists could be hired for a fee, and they would teach any man how to argue to make any situation look good or bad. So that's a different kind of view of, well, not different view of rhetoric, but a different, I guess, mobilization of rhetoric, in that it's more about verbal skill, right? How can I convince you that this thing that you think is bad is actually good? So I think that's kind of speaking a little bit to, what you just said about how is rhetoric, used to continue these habits or to break these habits. It can be used for anything, which is why I think rhetoric still gets a bad rap today. Definitely a lot of the other ancient Greeks hated the sophists because they thought, well, they're charlatans, right? People are paying them so that they can teach you how to lie better, basically. And so I think, when people hear the word rhetoric today, they think, oh, political rhetoric, right? This politician, their rhetoric is, swaying people one way or another. And yes, rhetoric can be used in that way, but I don't think it's necessarily the only way we want to conceptualize rhetoric, especially when we're talking about rhetoric beyond the human. So let me just think about a good way to really address what you're saying. I guess our rhetoric could be used to encourage people to maintain the same habits, or to break their habits and take up something completely new, right? But it's not as if, well, the person is trying to persuade me to do this, or this object is trying to persuade me to do this, so I will 100% always do that thing. It's still a give and take with the audience member, or with the user, or whoever is being rhetoricked upon. That's not an expected. But you know what I mean? Like, it's always a give and take. It's going to be whatever. I guess the effectiveness of the rhetorical appeal is going to depend on how well the rhetor understands the person they're addressing. So, someone could try to sell me something, but if it doesn't meet my needs, if I don't like how they're trying to sell it to me, right, then I'm not going to be persuaded. So it's way more complex, and there's so many little interplays between the different aspects of, the audience, the message, and the sender of the message. So that's why I think rhetoric needs to be an art, because it is something that needs to be honed through a really strong awareness of different factors of the audience, of the message itself, and how it can be adapted using, the available means of persuasion.
Going back to what you were saying previously about this almost like negative association we have with rhetoric, is sort of like the immediate, like the use of rhetoric in order to get somebody to explicitly do something. But then I suppose, like you mentioned, there's the understanding of the audience, there's the audience member, there's how the message is conveyed, the medium of the message, and then I suppose there's also this aspect of like the more like the subtle persuasive messages. And I think this is kind of where maybe we can jump into a little bit of the smartphone and talking about this idea you've been thinking about for for quite a long time. So I know, I suppose your thesis is a big thesis, but can we try to start at the beginning of where you view the smartphone through this lens of, perhaps, I don't know if this is a correct classification, but like sources of rhetoric and persuasion we should be maybe more aware of that we're not
With regard to the smartphone?
with regards to the smartphone. Do you think that's a fair classification of like where, of what you look at the lens of the smartphone through, or how would you sort of line that up?
Yeah, so for the smartphone, what I did in my dissertation, and I've extended it now in my book, but I wanted to use different rhetorical lenses to analyze the smartphone, to kind of dig into some of these aspects, which, as you mentioned, aren't necessarily overt. And so people don't necessarily realize that they're being persuaded, right?
Can you just define overt for us?
Overt, yeah. So
Yeah.
overt is like the obvious ways, the ways that you can see, you can identify, again, like an advertisement. If an advertisement pops up on your YouTube, you think someone is trying to persuade me to buy that thing.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a lot of other aspects of the smartphone, front to back, that are persuasive, that maybe don't appear to be persuasive, or that don't strike people as having a persuasive intent to them, right? Because the thing is, with a smartphone, and with all digital technology, every single aspect of the device is designed. It's a choice that could have been otherwise, which is different from previous communications technologies, in that a lot of them looked the way they looked and functioned the way they functioned because they had to. There was no other, or alternatives were not readily available. There had to be maybe lots of wiring, or it had to be this particular material because it was the only material that could withstand the heat or the pressure or whatever, right? So in the past, technologies were formed out of function, and with limitations because of that. Whereas with digital technologies, things look the way they look because the particular aesthetic has been selected amongst many other aesthetics to to contribute to a brand, or to give people a certain feeling when they interact with the device. With Apple, for example, they had a specific, and still do, of course, but they had a specific brand ethos developed. I can't remember what it was specifically, but it was something like cool, minimalist, but inviting. So they had these kind of key words and terms that then shaped how their devices functioned, how the interfaces looked, how the computers looked. Right? When you interact with a Mac, oh, I'm interacting with a Mac, and it's different than a PC because they're built and designed differently to give the user a different user experience. So with the smartphone, every single aspect of it has been selected to look, to interact, to be a certain way. And so that's what I'm interested in digging into, because even though I think people know that, right? When I say that, you think, oh, well, yes, of course, right? Someone designed each of these aspects. These are choices that are made. People don't often think about it when they interact with the device, computer, laptop, because you're just using it, right? It's this kind of window into what you want to be doing, right? I want to message my friend, I want to send an email, I have to, check my bank statement. So the utility of what the user is doing can prevent them from thinking about the way that they're able to do that. Does that make sense? Yeah. And so, sorry, yeah.
Well, no, before we go like a layer deeper, I have two spokes from this that I want to clarify. So first, you mentioned, I suppose at the outset, we should say that we're not necessarily saying it's positive or negative. There's no moral attachment to this. Your curiosity is exploring what are these rhetorical elements of the device, rather than ascribing this is bad and this is good. I mean, that comes maybe later into the derivation, but before we go dig down more into that, you mentioned this aspect of design, right? These devices are designed for a particular use, right? And when you said the smartphone, I thought about like the telephone, for example. Like you think about the affordance, which in design philosophy for the listeners here is, affordance is sort of the kind of inviting nature of design, if that's correct. So when you think of like a classic payphone telephone, the way in which the arm of the telephone is shaped kind of invites the user to pick it up by that element and then put it up to their ear. So I was thinking about the affordance of the telephone versus the smartphone. And I suppose at this layer, you're saying not necessarily you're applying this like positive or negative to the design. You're just saying in the same way that a telephone had this principle of affordance, right, physically manifest, these aspects of rhetoric are also in these digital devices. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, definitely. And the point on affordance is something I was going to touch on. So I'm glad that you brought it up, because yeah, you're exactly right. So every, I guess, object, is that the right word? Every object has affordances and constraints. So things that encourage you to interact with them in certain ways and not in others. So a door that has a handle, you're going to assume that you pull it, right? You know those stupid doors where
bad doors.
you see a handle, you go to pull it, and then there's a little sign above it that says push. People see the affordance before they're going to read the thing. So they're, you will visually realize, oh, I'm supposed to pull on this. No, you're supposed to read the thing and then push on. So yeah, in the case of smartphones, their affordances at the beginning, I'm not necessarily saying good or bad, rather just pointing out the different affordances and the effects that those affordances have on users in terms of how they would interact with the phone. Like, for example, early cell phones had very different affordances than smartphones now. So that's why, even though they're both technically mobile phones, well, what does a Nokia brick phone allow you to do? Type very, very arduously to send a message, call someone, and take a photo that's made of like 6 pixels. So that is super different than the smartphone now, which is this mini computer where you could basically stay inside for months and never have to leave, because the smartphone has so many affordances in terms of its user interface and user experiences. It has so many affordances that you could just ostensibly live inside forever, except for getting exercise and such. But you know what I mean? So the way that the smartphone can fill into people's lives and the roles that it can play because of its affordances are very different than cell phones of an earlier era, for example.
Okay, so to take a step kind of deeper into this thesis, right? So you mentioned, and for me, what's sort of coming in is this idea that unlike the analog world, right, which you kind of have different devices having different purposes, right? So I have a journal. A journal is where I write. A keyboard is what I type on. A pen is what I write with. In the digital world, causal to, I suppose, like Turing's, what Turing's theories say, which is like you can sort of do any task on a computer. It kind of allows this. I don't have a good word for this. Maybe you have a good word, but like compression of abstractions into just like a single modality, right? So it's not like you need to know how to hold the pen and use the pen, or like use this notebook to write, or use a keyboard. It all comes through you use this beautiful word, this window, this like singular window. So stepping into that, then I suppose what you're also describing is like, because we kind of step into this new like reality, causal to stepping into this window, in this new reality, we no longer have the constraints that we might have otherwise had.
Yeah, so to answer that in 2 parts, the first, the word that you may be looking for is convergence. It's by Henry, there's an idea developed by Henry Jenkins, who's a communications scholar, but it's what it sounds like, and it's the idea that all these different forms of media converge into one device. So the smartphone is a convergence of many other types of media, as we've thought, right? It's a phone, it's a computer, it's a calculator, it's an agenda, it's all these other things that used to be separate, but now they've converged and they just exist in one device, which may seem like, oh, amazing. Now I don't have to buy an agenda, or I don't have to carry a calculator, things like that, right? So it seems like it's just out of convenience. Oh, it's so nice. But as you mentioned, when you step through that window, or, into the screen, all of a sudden, all these other aspects of life that used to take place in different contexts are all homogenized into the same place. They all take place on the phone. And so one of the things that I looked at and was kind of concerned with is that the different aspects of our lives that take place, again, in different settings with different people in person, those all get compressed into this, flat screen that you're interacting with. And so the moods, the emotions, the physical experiences that used to be separated across time and space are now just in one device, converged. And I was actually recently reading that there's research to show that, and more recent research, I should say, but even in the past, research to show that writing by hand has a much different impact on memory and retention of the information than typing. Mm-hmm. So I always encourage my students, we're going to write by hand and do journal entries by hand, because that actually helps you remember information. So reading things on a screen, typing and writing on a screen impacts the brain and your body differently, of course, than writing by hand or talking. So that was something that worried me when I was looking into all of this, because sure, it's convenient to just have one device. You don't need to talk, you don't need to leave the house, you can just type, you don't need all these different accoutrements in your life. But a lot gets lost when we do away with that, I think.
Yeah, oh my gosh, there's so much in there. Starting with one of the research items that you mentioned, I think, I don't recall what the name of the author was, but it was a study between students that wrote essays by computer versus by hand. Mm-hmm. And what they found was the economics of writing by hand is lost on a computer. So what do I mean by that? When you write on a computer, it's easy to add more, hard to delete. Mm-hmm. And I think this came from, maybe it was Julia Cameron's The Artist's Way, or somebody like somebody similar to that. But that phenomenon is flipped when you write. When you write by hand, hard to add, mm-hmm. easier to delete.
Yeah.
And the consequence is that essays written by computer tend to be more verbose. The sentence structure is more complex. The articles, all these things they tend to be a little bit more drawn out, mm-hmm. versus by hand, things are a little bit simpler. And if you were to, I suppose, bring like an evolutionary psychology perspective to the equation, in some sense, we've had written paper and writing by hand longer on an evolutionary time scale, mm-hmm. than we have computers, right? So in my head, at least logically, I can make an association that says there would be a higher adaptive advantage at the moment for writing by hand versus by computer, just because of I hate the word synergy, but the synergy between that over a longer time scale. But then you said this other just brilliant point, which is, I just want to spell it out because I think it's really important to understand, is like, you said, because we step into this window, we step into this virtual world, which removes all physical constraints. Mm-hmm. We no longer have to be in proximity to people in order to have a conversation, let's say, or to go out to the pizza store to go buy pizza. Because you step into this window, there's this convergence of not only all the context, but the emotions. Mm-hmm. And I thought that was so curious, because I wonder, and I tend to approach things with like the evolutionary psychology framework. I wonder how much of the adaptive advantage of those things being segmented to particular contexts gets lost, right? Like, that under a particular, meeting or place that you go, like, there's certain behaviors that you display, and there's certain behaviors that maybe you don't display. Mm-hmm. But because everything gets converged to one particular point in time or point in place, everything gets mixed up, and your brain is kind of like not able to. If I was to use a very simple kind of psychological example, it'd be like, there's a version of you at work, and there's a version of mm-hmm. you at home, and it's like both of those things get melded together.
Yeah, and I would definitely agree with that. I mean, I'm pretty sure, and I can't remember where I saw this, but there's studies done that when COVID happened, people were working from home, everyone was thinking, oh, great, everyone's going to get so much more done because they don't have the water cooler chat, they don't have the commute. But what they found was productivity actually went way down when people were at home, because you're asking them to put themselves in a work mindset when they're at home, right? So it's this kind of, I guess, idea that, like you said, you're a different, not a different person, but there's a different side of you at work than at home. And so when those start getting mixed together and converged, it can be, I think, challenging to separate them. It's kind of, I don't know if this is similar, but it's the kind of idea that, okay, if you wouldn't say something to someone face to face, don't say it to them online, right? I don't know if you've, like, if that is a common expression, but you know, the problem with people trolling online or people cyberbullying online, it's, I think, partly due to the fact that you're not actually saying that to someone's face. You don't get the physical reaction of, you know, speaking that way to someone. Whereas when you're online, you're not actually saying those words out loud, you're typing them. And because they're typed, your brain, it's short-circuiting your brain, right? You're not even writing them out in a letter that you're going to go send to this person, right? So it's this, again, this loss of context and this short-circuiting of emotion that would formerly have to be expressed physically, verbally, emotionally, and with the person that you're speaking to being directly present to experience that. And this all kind of connects to this idea of Stimmung, which means mood. And this is from Hans Gumbrecht, I think, who's a really great philosopher at Stanford. But Stimmung and mood is what is being lost in the digital age, because we don't have these moods that come from presence, from people being together, right? So when you're just online, there's no mood. You're just in this, like, you know, looking at this flat screen and it's blasting in your eyes. And so people will type things, will say isn't the right word, but will write things that they would never say because there's no context, because there's no mood, there's no person on the other side of that screen. So in that way, it almost turns people, and sorry, I'm getting way off here, turns people into objects and flattens them. We can talk about that more. I know this always happens when we talk. There's like 8 different ways we could go with this. I'm always writing so many notes whenever Robert and I have conversations, and then I'll look and it's this crazy chicken scratch, but
that's why we had to have you on the podcast. That's why we had to. No, but there's, I mean, you know, it's incredible because, you know, once upon a time, and I think we've talked about this, you know, I said that I think the person who invented emoticons should win a Nobel Peace Prize, because emoticons, and this came from like a prior argument I had with a computer science professor. And I said, you know, I'm really frustrated by textual communication because I feel like there's a loss of information. I think the statistic I read is 80% of our communication is body language, right?
Yeah.
So even by removing yourself from a physical location, you've already lost, you know, let's say the data transmission is 100 megabytes, right? You have to transmit 100 megabytes from your brain to somebody else's brain, and you remove them from the room, you've already lost 80%, 80 megabytes from that message. You then take that and then you have to write it out into a letter. And the sort of thing I say, well, all of us are not necessarily equipped to articulate our thoughts. So maybe it's sort of a really bad compression, right? And then we lose more information. So then we end up with this like very, very kind of lossy format of data transmission that then the other person has to pick up, unbundle, and then interpret. And so then there's a cause for a lot of misinterpretation. And so the point that the professor I was speaking to said is like, there's a loss of information, like from an information theory perspective. And so I said, well, I think the person who did the emoticons, because what they did is they tried to add information density to the message, right? And I had this whole thing, I was like trying to invent a language, and I was like trying to figure out how to add, it made no sense. And I was like, machine learning AI will do it. And it's like, you have no idea what you're talking about, dude. Like, you really don't. But what you said is right. I can't pronounce that word. You said schmood?
Stimmung.
No chance.
Mood.
The word that you mentioned for mood, like that is lost. And so even that idea that people become flat, and even within that adjective, right, the flattening of people, it very much mirrors the same like substrate that you're experiencing through, right? It's a flat screen. There's no 3 dimensions.
Yeah, and I think this idea of flatness, it's contrary to what people think, I think, because people say, oh, well, I have so many different, you know, personas online that I can have it. So I actually have a much more rich and complex, ability to display myself or to experience my life in different ways online. And in some ways, yes, that is true, right? Because you can inhabit different personas online, like people who have Instas and then Finstas, like fake accounts, just for their friends or things like that. So yes, people can display their lives in more ways, but not in ways that necessarily allow for more depth. And even if someone participates in total self-disclosure online, that doesn't necessarily translate to the real world. And I know even making that distinction is sticky now because people say, well, there isn't really a clear divide between online and physical world, right? They're always kind of weaving together, especially now because of the smartphone and, soon to be more strongly integrated augmented and virtual reality. But it's this idea that even though you're moving through the physical space, people are always aware of the digital world. Why else do people stop to take pictures and post them on their Instagram right away, for example, right? So even as you're moving through the physical world, experiencing these moods that come through everyday interaction with the physical world, those moods are now also being, I don't want to say compromised because that's a bit strong of a word, but definitely impacted by the digital, right? This place with no mood, because people are sharing, they share what's in the physical world in an online space, right? So there's this kind of transmission and slippage between the two. It's like when you're at a meeting or at a family dinner and you're like, oh, well, probably not at a meeting, but if say a family dinner and you think, oh, this is really nice, right? We're having a good time. And then you look and someone's on their phone. So they're just totally rejecting the mood or the communal aspect that has been built up through the people present. People do this at meetings too. People do this in class, right? I'm teaching. I have a no cell phones policy. This is my one rule. I'm a big, believer that we all need to be here and be present. Inevitably, kids will be on their phones. I'll be like, do you have something important? Like, oh no, sorry. Well, you know what I mean? So it's just interesting, this infiltration now of non-moods.
I used to have this like existential problem part of the course, but I used to say something like, I felt like millennials grew up with a very interesting adaptation. The adaptation was that they grew up with pure analog and the transition to digital. And I used to say something that I think that gave millennials this adaptive advantage in the form of being able to like ignore advertisements, for example, or just, kind of filter it out. And then I sort of imagined like an odometer on a car. And I said, okay, well, if you had like, 100 points that you had to allocate in terms of your value systems between what you value in the analog world, the digital world. And so when I say analog world, I mean like people that you meet in real life, the real life connections that you have, the friends and social events that you go to, the things I would say that generally fill the human soul, so to speak. Not it's again, it becomes difficult with the digital world because there are cases where things can be fulfilling, but I do question that as well.
Yeah.
I do question that as well. But then I imagine this barometer and I said, I wonder if the millennials were the last generation where the value system rating was like 60% I value the physical world and then 40% I value the digital world. In which case there was still a majority vote of the physical over the digital. And then I got really worried because if you grew up as a Gen Z, you have a phone in your hand probably at like 4 years old. And if you don't even have a concept of self before 5, how does that change your value system? And maybe I thought, okay, well, maybe Gen Z is the first generation where we have a 60% I value the digital versus the physical. And the reason I kind of want to lay of the land is because I want to go a step deeper into your thesis as well, because I think we both kind of have a mutual understanding of like there's implications to these changing landscapes, if you will.
Yeah, definitely. So in terms of that kind of shift from analog to digital, there's 2 books by psychologists that I would really highly recommend. One is Sherry Turkle's Alone Together, and that is about why teenagers, and this was written, I think, in the 2010s, but why teenagers of the Gen Z generation experience a lot more loneliness and self-doubt and these kind of problems that I think stem from what you're saying, and that they grew up with the phones basically in their hands, right? So they didn't get the chance necessarily to, to develop these experiences that before the phone were taken for granted, right? Going out and playing with friends, and your parents saying, "Oh, be home by sunset," right? And now we're waxing poetic and we sound like really, the old folks here. But it's funny though, because even though we're technically only a couple years older than Gen Z, the experience of growing up that we had was quite different than children now, children even 10 years ago. And so I'm just trying to remember where I was going with that.
The second.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So, but sorry, just to wrap up Sherry Turkle, it was just the point that kids did not get to have the sense of adventure and experiencing things because their phones were in their pockets and their parents were on their phones. And so they didn't get a chance to experience life kind of on their own, if that makes sense.
To build that sense of like, I mean, there's a danger, right? If you don't have the phone, there's a danger that you can't call mom or dad. And so you have to build this internal model of learning how to trust yourself, that you can figure out the situation.
Exactly. Yeah. So there's not that opportunity to learn to trust oneself or to experience. And this is actually one of the most important takeaways from the book, is that kids who grow up with phones don't get the chance to experience emotions and process them on their own, because they either share that emotion, right? They have to text someone if something good happens, something bad happens. They have to distract themselves, right? Oh, I just got bad news, but I'm just going to watch this video, or distract myself in other ways. And so what she says is that kids who've grown up with phones don't know how to be alone. They only know how to be lonely. And when I shared that line with my students in my Rhetoric of Smartphones class, I got back 20 looks of just utter, shock's not even the right word, but just this resonance, right? Like they were, because then they thought about it. And I think many of them realized that they don't actually know how to be alone, right? Because when you have the phone with you, even when it's not on or when it's on silent, you're not alone. It gives you access. It's that window that you can step through, look through at any time to get any amount of content. That's why when I ask my students to put their phones away, even for an hour, they get really anxious because it's just them and me. So that was the one book, Sherry Turkle, excellent. The other book is by Jean Twenge, and it's called Generations, and it's excellent. It gives it has a chapter on each generation, from the greatest generation all the way to, I think it's alpha, whatever the really young kids are now. We're starting out, we're starting again. Alphas. And and her main argument.
Who made up this system?
I definitely wasn't consulted because it makes no sense. Oh, polars. Anyways, you read the book, you'll find out. She argues that it's not changes in the world that create difference between generations, but technological developments. So, the generation that grew up with the internet versus with smartphones or, computers, it's these technological changes that really shape how people grow up and how their worlds develop, which I really can see, again, just coming full circle with the way that I grew up as a kid. I also, for the record, wasn't allowed to have a phone until I was in grade 11, which is very hard for me because all of my friends had phones. And so I would literally be walking home with my two friends and they would be calling each other on the phone on either side of me, talking to each other. And I'm in the middle going, okay, guys, can we talk about science class? But no, they had to be using their phones just because they had them. So the idea that technological developments are the biggest kind of factor in how people's values are shaped, the relationships they have, etc.
Okay, so can we take a step deeper into this thesis, because I think, I mean, there's so much more to cover on like the landscape, but I feel if we start with like layer one, where we said, okay, design is the key. And why do there's lots of motivations for design. There can be ease of experience. I mean, there's cases of terribly designed software. It's frustrating. You're trying to remove that frustration. But then as developments in technology, mobile internet, cheaper bandwidth, all these things became more available, you had the emergence of, I suppose, what I view as, and this is how I try to increasingly look at the computing through the lens of, is computing used to be a tool, right? It was a tool, it was a word processor, it was a spreadsheet, it was your calculator. This was all awesome. This was so great. But then there was this change, and it was the integration of entertainment into the device. Can we take a step deeper into the thesis?
Yeah, so I think you're exactly right? Because computers used to serve functions. You're right, they were tools. But then when it became about, okay, well, how can we add entertainment to the mix? How can we retain people's attention? I think that's when maybe the negative aspects of persuasion started to become a little bit more prevalent, because when it becomes not about how can I make the best word processing tool, but how can I get people to use this word processor and not others? Or how can I get people to, get these extensions or to spend more time on the computer overall, or computer or smartphone? Because in this case, they serve a lot of the same functions. But when there's that element of, making decisions based on retaining people's attention, people's time, getting them to spend more time on said device, right? Because the thing is, if the computer or if your phone was just a phone that you make calls on and texts on, and then you put it away, that's not making many people money. But when there's all these apps on them, and other entertainment-based or time-passing, I don't know, tools isn't the right word, but time-passing, applications. Well, again, I think when that gets mixed up with tools that are supposed to be just for serving certain functions, that's when we start to get potentially some problematic potential for use, patterns and practices. And this builds into captology, which is the study of computers as persuasive technologies. It was developed by a guy named Fogg over at Stanford. But computers as persuasive technologies was basically, he did a bunch of experiments to see, well, how do we make computers more persuasive? And, what are the effects that we can have from that? And I think he meant it in a well-intentioned way. Like, they were looking at apps to improve how seniors take their medicine. So your phone will send you a notification. Oh, you should, take your medicine now. And so they did a bunch of tests to see how computers can be made persuasive. And again, that's not with the actual content of the messages, but how the messages are conveyed. So, for example, using a text box with big bold letters is going to make someone react differently than a little text box with light text or exclamation marks. So all these different mutable factors in how computers, and by extension, smartphones, smartwatches, how they address the user. And so what they found is that, technology can absolutely be made more and more and more and more persuasive. And what we get now is that because there's so much data on how people interact, like data from interactions, it's possible for designers, whether, of phones, of apps, of particular features, to triangulate and pinpoint what is the most persuasive. Even when people's eyes track on a screen, what do they stay on the longest? So there's so much data on how people interact with digital devices that they can be, I guess, calculated to the absolute, smallest level of, do we move this text over to the center? Is that going to change how people read it and interact with it? So, these studies on captology dovetail with human-computer action, psychology, lots of different, I guess, ways of approaching it. But that was one of my first steps into this question, concern about smartphones as persuasive technologies, as rhetorical agents, because I think, wow, if this is being calculated, what else might be, being taken into consideration in how people use and interact with their devices?
Okay, can we pause here, because I have a big question. My question is, you used to buy software. You used to buy Microsoft Word. You used to buy some form of box software or something like that. And what you're kind of referring to with this motivation. So let's just use that single example. We want to figure out how do we get more people to click on this button, right? And then we acquire a bunch of data points through observation. And all of that is like data-driven decision making. It's a quantification of different attributes of the usage of the app, the software. Why do you think or what do you think changed? Like, why did this aspect of retention become so important?
That is a really good question. I mean, my main answer would be greedy capitalism. Just, I think when all these markets opened up, right, when it was realized that, oh, we can collect out on this, we can, make changes to better ensnare isn't the right word, but to better engage people. That's the kind of, sorry, yeah.
Sorry, but what aspect? Because I think that's very, like, I'm trying to think of it from two different angles, right? So one angle, I understand there's sort of two worlds. We're running two parallel worlds almost. One is the tools, right? So we're building apps as tools, right? This job, I hire Uber because it's going to get me a cab, right? So that's one form. Then we have another form, which is this parallel universe of entertainment. So entertainment to me has a very obvious retention use case, right? I want to retain more people on this because usually entertainment apps like social networks are fueled by advertising, right? So the model that I read was in the growth of a lot of social networks during like the 2010s and beyond was after a certain point in time, every person who wanted to get a social networking account on a particular network had one. And so it was less about vertical growth and more about horizontal growth in terms of how much more time can you have a user spend on a platform. So I completely understand in the entertainment case why retention would matter. And then if your gold star metric as a business is how do we increase retention because we know retention has a derivative on revenue, then we can create these design decisions, and that's where persuasion and rhetoric becomes very important. But what happened in the tools? Why do you think retention became so important in the tools? Was it also this, like you started early on in this conversation, this brand affiliation, this retention to the product, to the service?
Yeah, I think that is definitely plausible, right? Because the tools that are offered alongside the entertainment are part of the brand ethos of whatever company is offering them. So I know a lot of people like using Mac because they like the specific tools that are offered, or they like using PCs because they hate the way that Mac interfaces work. So I don't really have a good answer specifically for why retention for the tools is important. I almost feel like that's kind of secondary now.
Okay.
Because people don't buy smartphones because they like, how the messaging app works. They buy it because of the total package. That's kind of now so entwined that we don't even think about having separate devices. Like, you used to you'd have your mini DVD player, you have your phone, and you'd have your MP3. So they were all separate, but because they're all together now, I don't even know if people are really considering, these distinct aspects. But that's something I should definitely look into because I'm also interested in that distinction between the tools and the entertainment. But
I wonder if what happened was, because you're right, you buy a smartphone, you don't think about different, I'm going to have this. I mean, it's such a great calculator. I can't wait to buy my own because I'm going to get the best calculator, right? It's not something that you think about. You think about complete access. And I think of the smartphone as just a mini computer. So anything you can do on your computer, it's just a mini computer in your pocket. And I wonder if when the entertainment angle came into it, that's when it kind of kicked off this entire cascade, because people were going to buy the phone because they wanted the entertainment, right? And then side by side, I mean, the tools came first, but then you add the entertainment in it, so it increases the total ecosystem value, right? So now you have the iPhone, you get great messaging, but you also get all your favorite apps, right? And what are your favorite apps? Your favorite apps are mostly entertainment. I mean, look at the top 10 apps on the App Store. Most of them are forms of entertainment. I would say, I would argue the majority. So I wonder if that was then when the metrics started getting very important with regard to kind of retention and keeping. I guess retention's always been important from business, right? Because you want to retain your customers so that you can continue to operate. But this aspect of then making the design more persuasive, because then I guess you also have an intention marketplace, right? In the sense of you're bartering to try and compete with the attention somebody's going to get from us, or sorry, you're bartering for the attention of the user that could otherwise go towards a social network or watching videos or any of these things. So then you have to apply different design practices or rhetoric in order to attract to your app in order to get retention from that angle.
Yeah, and what you've seen with apps in the last couple of years is they've all homogenized a little bit. Like in the early days, Snapchat was pictures that delete themselves after 24 hours. Did they have stories in the early days? I think they started stories.
They did start stories, but they first did the disappearing, then they added the stories.
Yeah, and so after they added the stories, well, now Instagram has stories and Facebook has stories. So it's the same thing with where, Tim Hortons is now offering subs and pizzas, and you think, why are you doing that? But it's because they're capitalizing on what other chains are doing in fast food. And so it's the same with social media, where they think, oh, well, if this person likes watching short videos, well, we'll integrate short videos into our platform so that people will spend more time on our platform instead of doing the same thing on a different platform. So like you said, it's this kind of competition for what is in effect a limited amount of attention, right? It's a limited resource. People only have so many hours in the day. They're spending many hours of the day, many more than I would feel comfortable with on average on social media on their phones. But that's again where the kind of nefarious persuasion comes in, right? What makes our app more engaging, more fun to interact with, easier to spend time on? And there's also, of course, been a huge rise in advertising on social media because it's free. But again, people will remember the earlier days where there were no ads, or maybe there was 1 or 2 ads, but now every 3 or 4 posts you see is an advertisement. So I think maybe that's a way that the companies that create these platforms are trying to increase the amount of value that they get for the the time span of the attention, at least from a monetary perspective. But
yeah, I mean, if you broke it down from a metrics, right? If you know that you're going to be able to, you would start, right? You would say, okay, let's say an average user is I think the stat I read was an average person spends 13 minutes a day on Instagram, probably like a couple of years ago. And so if you know that somebody is going to spend 13 minutes on your platform, and in those 13 minutes, you can serve a maximum of let's say 15 ads, right? And then for each CPM, cost per milli, you're going to get X amount of dollars. The logical conclusion is that if you want to increase revenue, you would just add more ads to that sequence. So instead of 15 ads, let's just use 10 for simplicity, 10 minutes a day, instead of 10 minutes, 1 ad a minute, you just double that, right? You add 20 ads in 10 minutes. And so that doubles your revenue, right? So it gives you an advantage on that perspective. It decreases your user experience, which is an interesting trend that I'm observing personally, is I feel like, as you mentioned, this homogenization is kind of killing a lot of these different platforms in a sense, because they don't really even know what they are anymore. You have shorts on YouTube, you have long form video on YouTube. Every sector has like a focus, which is probably like the majority driver of most of the engagement. But then these bolt-on features kind of make this homogenization, which is unclear of what any of these apps are unique for. So could we take a step deeper then into your thesis? Because I feel like maybe perhaps what you're getting even closer to as we get lower and lower down, we don't have to go through the whole thing, but it's just, there's a lot of layers, right? And that's why I wanted to set us up at each layer so that we could understand the implications, understand the motivations, because you said this one point, which was like, even by virtue of having your credit card in your cell phone, this can cause you to kind of make like quick purchases that I think the word you use, like the consequences are abstracted away sometimes. And we've sort of you sort of touched on this with saying, like, you'd send a message to somebody that maybe you wouldn't otherwise say that thing to their face. But can you talk a little bit about that is it loss of context or loss of awareness to the long-term consequences?
Yeah, so that's exactly what it is, because when everything is converged into the device and it's all easy to access, right? You just tap through and there's your credit card. It doesn't register as something that's taken place in the physical world with the consequences that would be attached to, things in the physical world. Like, I'm sure there was a similar, I haven't researched this, but a similar phenomenon that occurred when people switched from using cash to using credit cards, right? Because when you're handing over those dollars or those coins, the transaction feels very real. When you're swiping a card, it's less obvious what is actually happening, right? That transaction is kind of reduced in its perceived scale. And when it's on the phone, it's even less so, because you're clicking a button and then you tap your phone, and your phone's always in your hand anyways. So you're not actually even, getting out a credit card or getting out cash. So I think, again, it's that loss of context and this kind of loss of distinction between, okay, real world event, this is happening, and just flipping a screen on your phone. And a concept that I find really interesting related to this, I'm meaning to write an article on this, but I just don't have time, is the idea of smoothness. And this comes from Byung-Chul Han. I can't remember which of his many books he talks about this in, but basically, when things are smooth, when they lack friction, they can be a big problem, because when you're out in the physical world, you're encountering friction all the time. Is it windy? Is it cold? Is it crowded, right? These things that create friction and a little bit of productive challenge in your encounter with the world. When you're online, things are very smooth. It's very easy to buy something, right? Whether tapping your phone or just hit the buy now button on Amazon. Amazon patented the buy now button because they realized it was so effective. They did, and they thought, we're going to stamp this, because when people already have their credit card information in their phone and they just have to hit a buy now button, that's such a smooth transaction process that there's very little to put the brakes on, right? That's why it's so much easier to go on shopping binges online than to go out to all these stores and spend all this money, right? So,
well, the potential criticism, though, would be that, going back to design, it's like, who would want to invent who would buy something that is frustrating, right? Like, that would be like one of the criticisms, I suppose, to this, is that we're ultimately, I used to have this thing go on in my head. I asked myself, do businesses solve problems or create things? And I used to argue back and forth between the two. And eventually the conclusion that I've sort of come to, the local maximum, which who knows, maybe that'll change, was that businesses solve problems, right? And there's a theory that I've talked about previously on this podcast called jobs to be done theory, which jobs to be done, you're familiar, is the idea that we hire products. We hire products because they do a job for us. And fundamentally, we're trying to substitute the effort involved with doing that task ourselves. So we go to the grocery store and we buy a can of beans because the effort associated with growing your own beans and harvesting them and doing all that is so much more than the amount of capital that you use to buy that. And so in some sense, like, I can imagine that some criticism would be that, well, why would you ever want to design things to be more effortful, to have more friction? Because that would create disincentive to use these things. But is maybe what you're approaching or stepping into is this, because you brought up, was it Byung-Chul Han? So German Korean philosopher. What maybe you're pointing to is that this idea of the loss of all friction in our existence. Like, I think back to a physics analogy, for example. If you don't have any friction, you just accelerate, to infinity, right? Well, maybe not infinity, but as fast as you can. You just keep accelerating, and your speed stays the same. And well, as you were just talking about this loss of productive friction, this productive challenge, this book, I haven't read it, but it's called The Comfort Crisis, right? The idea, the thesis of which my understanding is that because things have become so comfortable, so easy, we're sort of in this vacuity of meaning because we don't have productive challenge.
Yeah, and I would very much agree with that. I think, of course, we want to have products that are helpful. No one would intentionally design something that makes life harder or necessarily puts in more friction, unless it's, a weight vest where people want that productive friction so they can get stronger. But I think in general, the idea that we should necessarily just be reducing friction, making life more smooth, more easy, I don't think that that's necessarily an effective approach. And I think, like you touched on just now, it does contribute to, from this book, it does contribute to maybe a crisis in meaning, because if everything is smooth, then what is challenging, right? What can people accomplish or overcome if you can just stay inside and have every need met through your phone, for example, right? To bring it back to the smartphone. So, I mean, I think, of course, it's better to go out and buy a can of beans than to, decide in 5 years, I want a great bean salad. You could, right? Setting goals. But I think there's a point at which smoothness is not beneficial, and it can be detrimental to people's, personal, social growth. So I think we're kind of hitting that point, like with AI. We don't have to get into this. I know you talked about AI with your last guest.
We can go into it.
Oh my gosh, everyone loves talking to English professors about AI, but because it's like, oh, are you scared for your job? I'm
scared for the M dash. That's what I'm scared for.
Oh my gosh, I love the M dash. It's
and the word delves.
Oh my gosh, you don't know how many times I've seen this essay delves into it. Like, you don't even know what delves means. So anyways, I digress. See, this is what I mean. But the smoothness of the AI, right? As a student, well, I don't even have to write this essay. I'll just get the AI to tell me what I think, to hand in something that will look like I did this assignment. Especially, I think, for students, we don't want that, because the point of being a student is you struggle through things. You learn things by challenging yourself to go beyond what you can already do. So by having prosthetics that will do that for you, that then robs you of the opportunity to learn and to fail and to try again. So that's why I'm not super convinced that designing technology for the purpose of making life ever easier is the best approach. I can understand why people want to do that, right? Why would you not want to make life easier, better, safer? And of course, we should make life easier, better, safer in some ways. But I think there has to be maybe more thought put into how those metrics are set and then met through design.
Maybe the challenge is that you mentioned these three, better, safer, easier, right? And this might sort of seem totally off course, but like there is a way that you can do that, right? You can be a bubble boy, like a bubble boy or bubble girl, right? And you just live in a bubble.
Yeah.
But maybe what we're approaching is this challenge of our humanity, right? Where we're sort of seeing that, okay, well, we do need, like, just even to use the analogy you brought with the weighted vest, right? You want to increase the muscle mass of your body. You need that productive challenge. In the other case, I mean, you could look at, like, for example, one of the most I don't know if it's the most controversial, but a controversial topic at the moment is like the GLP-1s and these drugs that are helping people lose weight just by taking the drug. But they were originally diabetes medicine or something this. And it's created this kind of like challenge because people who are like, well, I worked out and like I did it the hard way, they sort of have lost the pride associated or the reward of pride associated with like being fit. And one could say, well, you've removed the productive discomfort of that experience. And I guess it goes back to that question of like, well, what happens when you remove all all discomfort or everything is easy. And I feel like a criticism would be that, well, if everything is easy, then you just reach to new challenges, right? You reach to higher, it's like, for example, with the AI stuff, it's like now people who don't know how to program can program with vibe coding, right? They can just tell the AI what to program. So it upskills people in this way. But a concern that I have is what happens if we just don't have any imagination anymore, right? Because imagination, is in some cases born out of boredom. And Han talks about this in the Burnout Society, where the machine doesn't have the ability to stop and introspect and be bored. It just gets the next instruction. And that metaphor is so compelling to me because it's physically manifest. If you just look at the subway, right? You just see people on the subway and it's just like, you get into the subway. What's the next instruction? You pick up your phone. What's the next instruction? You pick the app. What's the next instruction? You just scroll up. And it's this limitation of stop and reflect and what would you say, the non-orderly chaos part of living.
Yeah, this is something that I think Han is really concerned about, right? Because it points to this idea that it is in these moments where we are not captured by something that contemplation and imagination and the development of new ideas takes place. Whereas if every time you were bored, if every time, you had more than 2 minutes to sit and think, you looked at your phone, there's not actually that time to get that experience of contemplation. And this is, it's a big problem. I mean, there's a study done at, I think it was Harvard, that demonstrated that people, especially men, would rather give themselves voluntary electric shocks than sit in a room with nothing to do for 10 minutes. So basically, the participants had the option, they're in a room, the study folks told them, all right, you're going to be in here for 10 minutes. You can just sit here and do nothing. But if you want, here's this little button and you can shock yourself. And people would rather experience pain, physical pain from the shock than pure boredom of doing nothing. And 10 minutes isn't that long. So what it really, says to me is that people, are not getting to spend time with themselves. It goes back to the, how to be lonely but not alone. If you don't get to spend time with yourself, how can you hone your imagination or, your connection with yourself if there's always this mediating factor? So that is, again, another concern that I have about the way that the phone is positioned in everyday life, is that it's now become this acceptable companion anywhere, really. And then, of course, with the integration of AI, when it becomes such that, you talk to your phone and it talks back to you, then no one is really ever alone unless you turn off that feature, if that will even be possible. Because that's the other thing, right? When things update, things that used to be optional or not even present, all of a sudden now they're integrated. And you don't really get a say in that. And so these things and developments kind of get pushed through in a way that the user is the one adapting to the technology rather than the technology adapting to the user, which of course it does also, but it does that based on how the user shares and interacts with the device.
There's this new trend coming up. It's called dumb phones.
Oh, yes.
I think about replacing my smartphone with a flip phone very often. And I encountered this dumb phone. One was called the light phone. Another one was called the Medutia Complete or Compact or something like this. One was like an e-ink display, and it in effect limits all the ability to kind of. There's no app store, for example. There's none of these things. So it seems like we're coming to a precipice is not the right word, but we're coming to a landmark somewhere that at least there's questions. Is because even you mentioned like that's something that frustrates me. I have this concept called leave it alone software, where I think German companies are amazing at this and US companies are terrible. Where German companies seem very good at like creating great software that updates very infrequently. And in any updates that it makes is like in effect to productively improve the experience. It doesn't really break everything. Versus in North America, we seem to constantly be updating software. I mean, from a software engineering perspective, the fact that we have web apps created this disconnect between incremental rolling out new versions where you would have like okay, this is now the V2. And like, that's a difficult way to distribute software, but it also created this way where you could ship incremental and constant change. So no longer do you have a physical, not necessarily physical, but no longer do you have like a constant in terms of the software that you're using, but it's always changing.
Mm-hmm.
And so as a user, you're like, can you just stop updating it? Can you just leave it alone, please? Because I would like to just use it for a task.
Yeah, and there's actually a really great book on this called Updating to Remain the Same by Wendy Chun, who is a communications scholar. And her point is that there's this expectation and this impetus on people to be always adaptable to updating. In the past, it was if you were, stable and set in your identity and your beliefs and values, that was seen as a good thing, right? You had strong character. Whereas now it's shifted to this model where you want to be agile and able to update and, flexible. And if you look at job listings, there's been a shift towards those kind of terms used in what businesses are looking for. Just for example, in terms of the people they want to employ. So it's this shift towards flexibility, malleability of the person, which is reflected in the software, right? People don't want to use the same technology. Well, I don't want to say that. People probably don't. I would rather use the first Facebook that ever came out than the version we have now. But it's more that there's this expectation, right? I hate when the cover photo came in. I rejected the cover photo on Facebook for so long. I held out, but then it makes you get it. And I mean, I don't care now. But the point is that it's this assumed march of progress, right? You have to be on board, and eventually, if you don't update, you can't use the software at all. Like I'm always, as you might have guessed, like 5 models behind with my phone. So I had the iPhone 5 for a long time. And I was holding out, why would I get a new one? It works fine. And I think Apple actually got in trouble for this, but they basically let out a new iteration of iOS where it just did not work on my phone. And so I couldn't use it. So I was forced to get a new phone. So again, it's this, you have to keep up in order to keep using the technology. And what's interesting now in this shift away from that towards, people who are interested in light phones or dumb phones is that those are great because people are sick of smartphones. But at the same time, the people who have dumb phones are still going to be held to the same standards as people who have smartphones. So for me, my sense of direction is terrible. I lived in Waterloo my whole life, still needed to use my GPS at the age of 28 to find my way around. So just because I need a GPS, I use my smartphone for that. And if I did not have access to that, well, I would probably be late to a lot of things. But I couldn't say, oh, sorry, I'm trying to divest from my smartphone, so I'm late because I had to use a map or a GPS. That's not an acceptable excuse. So there's this assumption that people have and use phones, computers, the same kind of technology that everyone else uses. And so that's still the standard set, whether or not you personally use a smartphone for a dumb phone or no phone. So it's, you know what I mean? It's this kind of evolution that people are expected to keep up with, regardless of their actual material circumstances.
Yeah. It points to this idea that, what you mentioned here, especially like this is something I worry about with a lot of government services, for example. Like there's been a digitization of a lot of government services, which is phenomenal from an efficiency perspective. But then you get on that consistent iterative train. And then I have lots of, concerns from both like a security perspective, from a just a lot of concerns, but
many concerns.
Many concerns. Well, I mean, security, constant updates, like what's the availability, then you sort of get into the world of like cybersecurity and all of these elements, and then constantly always up. And then how do you make sure that you're hiring and employing the people who are going to be able to secure these systems in advancing demographics of cyber war and all these kinds of things. And it's not to say that we should stop that efficiency, because it is. I mean, reduces resource utilization from like a tree, less trees, less paperwork, less storage, which is all of a benefit. But I think what you've kind of pointed towards is this, and I wish I had like a good word for it. I call it like the leave it left behind phenomenon.
Mhm.
Like I often wondered what happened to the people who chose not to adopt the telephone. Like, did they just get left behind?
No one ever heard from them again?
No.
Unintended.
Right, but I think what you're pointing to is that society in itself is malleable, right?
Mm-hmm.
Our value sets are changing over time, and the challenge is, as an individual trying to live in that particular society, you're coming up against these constraints. And
Mm-hmm.
maybe what some folks are now realizing is that we're getting into this place where you said this idea, it's like the technology, it's like the cart leading the horse. Like the technology is leading the changes in the entire, even the vocabulary,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, as you mentioned, the job descriptions. And so there's questions about that. And I mean, one could make the case that, well, if you look at the market economy, there's competition, globalization has elevated the landscape. So there's a lot more competition from that perspective. So you need to be agile in a sense because your pool of basically products available has increased substantially. But I guess my question, and maybe this leads, one layer deeper in your thesis, is what do we do? What do we do about this?
So this is such a hard question. And of course, this is the $1 million question, right? What everyone wants to know is, what do we do?
Mm-hmm.
And in my dissertation, the approach that I took to answering this question was probably to the chagrin of my readers, is I chose to step back and say, I am not going to prescribe how we should address the situation, because there are already so many other aspects of our lives that are being prescribed by technology, by society, by other forces other than individuals who are experiencing their lives.
Mm-hmm.
And I think to look specifically at technology, algorithms that tell people what they like, show them things because they think that the algorithms are showing them things because they think, oh, you'll like this. So there's already so many ways in which life is kind of being prescribed and handed to people in a way that you're supposed to update, you're supposed to live like this, that it's really hard to say there's a one size fits all answer to address this problem. And that's why I took the rhetorical approach that I did in my project of saying, look, these are the ways on many different levels that your phones are persuasive, and the ways that they might be turning you towards certain actions, beliefs, behaviors than you might otherwise engage in. Because my thought is, giving people that knowledge then allows them to choose, right? Some people might truly say, I don't care, my phone does know me really well and I like it like this.
Mm-hmm.
And they're not going to change their mind necessarily because they know that information. But other people, and again, in this Rhetoric of Smartphones class that I taught, many students did say, I'm going to change how I relate to my phone. I'm going to put it away more, or I'm going to leave it out of important conversations, talk face to face with someone when I have a problem. So just the knowledge so that people can make whatever changes they feel are feasible in their lives. Because the other thing is the ability to, forego a phone, like to refuse technology of any kind, is in a lot of ways a privilege, right? People don't necessarily have the ability to put away their phone, or to, say, well, I'm not going to use a computer, I'm going to write everything by hand. If you're a retired person who, no one's relying on you for emails, then that's fine. But it's really, there's just so many different ways that people use and engage with technology that I think awareness, so that they can make their own decisions to the best of their abilities and modulate things in their own lives, is the best, at least that I am, as a humble rhetorician, am hoping for.
Well, I suppose, and yeah, so much came up there for me. It's almost this mature sense of one needs to find their own authority in regard to how they want to take the situation moving forward. And I feel what you mentioned there with regards to the good fortune to question whether I want to basically use a smartphone or not use a smartphone. I mean, some of it also comes down to questions about like that balance. I mean, for example, there were some of those policy decisions made in the EU to ban, I think it was like employers from reaching out to employees off of working hours on Slack or these kinds of things, where those are more, I suppose, policies or decisions that need to be made on the values level of a society,
Yeah.
right? But what you're saying is, well, so much of your life is already being, told what to do, and you're having all these elements. Let me just give you a perspective, and you can derive your own conclusions from that. Can I give you my perspective?
Absolutely, yeah.
I think I have a feeling that it's something of a yoga. Like I feel like it's there's this idea that like you don't reach enlightenment. It's sort of this cyclic process that you sort of start, you go through the whole yogic journey, and then you come to the end, and then you have this awareness, but it's not something that lasts. It's this constant practice. It's like this devotion. And I feel as though collectively we're undergoing this return to like these ancient practices, and essentially ways in which we're enforcing artificial adversity or abstinence in our lives. Like look at intermittent fasting, the growth of like cold plunge and saunas, right? These effective removal of stimulus. Well, I mean, cold plunge is a pretty big stimulus, but basically like putting yourself into a very primal environments of sorts, right? In order to cultivate that inner sense of knowing or awareness of how to make decisions. And maybe it's not necessarily that you're going to be able to, replace your entire smartphone, but maybe it's the decision that you want to buy a light phone or something like that. And so you'll stay connected in that way. But maybe the challenge is that while this is a macro phenomenon, it's like trying to figure out how best to fit in that world under your own authority. And this is kind of like a process of like having to go back into the ancient practices and connect more with those practices I view as like ways to cultivate your own sense of inner authority, like meditation or breath work or any of these things.
Yeah, and of course, all of these things become more difficult when people have phones buzzing beside them all the time. So it's this kind of, I don't know, self-perpetuating cycle, in that in order to be able to reconnect with the self, to take up these practices, one has to have the awareness and the ability to step away from these distractions. And so it's a delicate balance. I think in terms of the good point you brought up about government regulations for these things, the technology develops so fast that it's hard to regulate, because of course government regulations take longer to pass through, and then the phone's already updated past that, or the technology has changed again. So I think it's important that governments are paying attention to these things and trying to regulate and implement policies. But I think that it does come down a lot to the individual and how they are going to handle and relate to their devices, and not just their devices, but all kind of forms of distraction and attention, right? Where do you focus your attention in your life? And one thing that came up that I realized I forgot to say earlier in relation to Buddhism is, Siddhartha, what's his full name? I'm having a
Siddhartha Gautama Buddha.
Yes. So he had a life that was completely smooth, right? And it was made that way on purpose. It was when he encountered this friction that he was set off on this journey of self-realization. So that's why I think, just as we were talking about smoothness earlier, when things are too smooth, there isn't room for, growth or self-discovery, because one isn't ever pushed up against limits. So
yeah, well, I think the challenge I would have on the government regulation point is that I do think that there is, if you work in a startup, for example, there is cases where you have to be on call if the systems go down, and these are kind of, or maybe you're trying to build something, and being in an entrepreneurial mindset, if you're trying to build a public company one day, there are just kind of feats of effort involved that seem to be not necessarily conducive to that framework. Like, I mean, there's statistics that like people who are self-employed sometimes, and like being a tech founder or something, are like earning much less than like minimum wage in terms of the number of hours they work to these types of things. So I guess it's a challenge, but again, it goes back to what you said with it's the journey of the individual. And even to tie it back to what you mentioned about the friction, right? That's the process of self-discovery, uncovering and excavating your soul to figure out more about yourself and how you want to take on the world. But I think it's the awareness of these frameworks or modalities to approach these issues. Because even for me, it was somebody made this point to me, they said, like, if you think about the gratification you get by getting a like on your photo on a particular social app, that let's just say that's like 1/10 of the gratification or pleasure that you would receive from eating something sweet, right? If you're getting that constantly throughout the day, that could change your chemistry, right? In terms of how your what amount of pleasure chemicals you need in order to feel a bit above baseline, right? And then obviously any signal obviously, or any crest obviously has a trough, so then you have the counterbalancing force to that. So maybe it is, as you said, providing that information and then allowing individuals to make the choices themselves.
Yeah, I mean, that's the best, like I said, that I can do. What I worry about is that
You
people
can't save us, Shannon.
do try. I'm a doctor, but I'm not a real doctor. No, but what I worry about is that if people are introduced to phones really early on in life, then it becomes harder to step outside of that symbiotic relationship that forms to see what life could be like without the phone. Like, I had my students do a 24-hour phone-free experiment. It was supposed to be 48 hours, but the looks that I got when I said 48 hours, they said, no way. But even asking these 18, 19-year-olds to separate from their phones for 24 hours proved to be nearly impossible for most of them. And so with that, it's kind of like, unless the individual is going to take a concerted effort to separate from their phone, to realize, okay, this is me, this is my phone, we are different. Because there's theories that what is it? That the technology extends the self. That's McLuhan. We know that. But the idea that people view objects that are important to them as direct extensions of the self. So the smartphone is seen as this literal extension of, of the person and who they are. So that's where it becomes hard to realize, who am I without the phone, if they've only ever had the phone. And so that's where awareness, is it enough? I don't know. Right?
Well, I think there's steps you can take. Like, for example, like I have a few different steps. Like I have a grayscale filter on my phone because the color and the pop is another way to captivate, draw me in, and all these things. So you set up these kinds of barriers. But you are pointing to, I mean, if I was to bring the optimist into the room, right, I would say, well, neuroplasticity, right? Our brains are plastic. So even if you had 19 years of believing that you had a phone attached to your brain and it was like inseparable, like you could unlearn that, or you could acquire enough experience and enough will assertion that at least you could embody a different state of mind than that state of mind, even if you could reactivate that state of mind at any point in time and just continue to refire and rewire the same circuits, right? It's sort of like I guess I'm drawing the metaphor to like addiction cycles, right? So if I was the optimist, I would say, neuroplasticity, we can unlearn things. I'm like very happy. I mean, if I was the pessimist, I would say like, I mean, it depends on how much. I feel like even in my pessimistic case, I still go to the optimistic case, because I feel like you couldn't, I mean, if we've been dealing with these questions of the self, of self-discovery, of what's the purpose, what's meaning, at some point in time, even by pure randomness, unless it's like 1984, right? You're going to encounter at some point some dude who posted something about Alan Watts on YouTube, and then you're just going to go down this like rabbit hole, and you're like, what is the point of anything? So I feel like that would make me somewhat optimistic about the future. And I do feel like there is big questions about people's mental health. And now with like some of the destigmatization of mental health challenges that people face, there is a realization. And I think even one of the statistics, it was with some of the Facebook research that was posted, it said something like I don't know if this is accurate, but it was something I was reading, and it said like a lot of teens wish that TikTok was never invented or something like that. So if I have like optimism for humanity, right, I feel as though in our hearts we'll be able to figure out how to find our way. Even if you have 19 years or 20 years of conditioning to the phone. My only concern in the case of pessimism is what are the limits to unprogramming ideas, right? And unprogramming core physiological neural circuitry in our brain. And I think we'd have to look at addiction research to understand what that is. And even then there's some promise in terms of some of the therapies that are coming out.
And I guess I would add to this for the pessimistic side, since more of my side
Your
of things,
flavor.
more to my liking, is that, despite, yes, we could, as a society, as a culture, move away from the, attention economy and all these kind of problems that we've talked about, that would only work if the corporations who are making these devices and making them persuasive are on board or are willing to change. Because I think, as the study that you talked about said, if most teens wish that TikTok hadn't been invented, they don't necessarily want to use it, but they still do, because it is still persuasive and engaging, and they probably feel like they don't have control. I mean, there was a lawsuit from many, I want to say 20 or so states against Facebook, because Facebook knowingly used tactics to cause addiction in young people. So this is the thing. So if you have corporations like Meta who are knowingly using kind of deceptive tactics to keep young people engaged in social media, even though everyone knows it's bad, even though it's agreed upon that people aren't spending too much time online and it is bad for mental health, right? So we know all these facts on the one side based on empirical research, but yet there are not dramatic changes being made to the social media platforms that cause these problems.
But wouldn't we have to put that on the individual though? Like at some point in time, like we have to ask, like, cigarettes are bad, for example. Like, it's, bad to smoke, and like you can acquire a smoking habit. But at some point I'm assuming there has to be some event or something that happens to the individual that causes them to make a change. I mean, I'm trying to critique my opinion, and I guess the only case would be like if you were inadvertently became addicted to a certain very highly addictive drug. But even in that case, my understanding, and I'm not a psychologist, but my understanding of at least the psychology of change is that there has to be a motivation from inside at some point. So even if you have all these external, because I feel as though sometimes, even though collectively we agree on particular characteristics that have a negative affect with regards to these like social media platforms or anything like that, there's obviously something we think we're still getting out of it that overrides, that creates a net value equation, unless we haven't thought about it at all, that is in the positive. Like for example, maybe you're using a platform in order to gain an audience because you want to market a product or something like that. So you're willing to deal with these challenges. Or maybe it goes back to what you were saying, where maybe you as a person don't care. Like you're like, it's fine. I actually prefer, and this is the whole personalized ad debate. It's like, maybe you prefer to just get like personalized ads.
Yeah. And I guess it really does, again, come back to the individual. And this also links back to what we were saying at the very beginning about how, yes, there's a message and a sender, but the audience also has agency, right? Like a rhetorical appeal isn't successful unless the audience then acts in accordance with what they were persuaded to do. Otherwise, they weren't persuaded, right? So it is always that give and take. But I guess I wonder if what a lot of people are getting from social media is, like you kind of pointed to earlier, not so much a conscious, I like this is good, as this fires, these circuits in my brain, and my dopamine levels are really high because I see all these likes. And so it's more habitual as opposed to a conscious choice of, or not conscious choice, that's not the right way to put it, but like an active benefit that people are getting. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, but we could also say that there's other, factors of like negative experience in our lives too that are kind of social. There's, I suppose what you're saying is like there's a social consensus
Yes.
that this is a positive thing. Like I'll use alcohol as an example, right? Alcohol is a socially consented drug. It's basically agreed upon that this particular drug, because it does create dependence in its users in some cases, it's agreed upon. There's bars, it's legally licensed, and all these things. And so that societally, that consensus by which society has made kind of creates this pressure, because then you think, for example, if you're underage drinking or something like that, so it's maybe not good for you, but you kind of continue to act in that way. So I don't know. I feel like I push back a little bit on the formation, and I kind of put a little bit of the onus on the individual a little bit, but I do understand where you're coming from, where it's almost like you've been swimming in water your whole life, and you're a fish. You didn't even realize you're like swimming in water because you didn't know anything other than that. And I think that's where maybe work like yours, or I guess a number of the different media outlets and things coming out with information kind of come into play.
Yeah, because again, like I said, I can't take people's phones out of their hands and say, this is bad for you. You should not be looking at this, right? Even if that's what I believe. But what I can do is point out the many ways that phones are persuading people to do certain things, or to view, have certain views or behaviors. And then the person decides for themselves, do I like how this is making me think or act, or do I not, right? And if they don't, well, then that is the friction that may cause them to make a change of whatever kind, right? So that's why I really like the rhetorical approach, because what I've seen is that, there's lots of scholarship on smartphones, mostly from communication and media studies, and it's really, really excellent. A lot of studies on behavior patterns and how people actually use the phones, but there isn't really any research on how smartphones themselves are rhetorically persuasive, right? Like how they persuade people to do things. And I don't mean just in terms of content. Again, oh, what is this ad telling me to do? What are these emojis saying? But the design of the phone and the processes that it kind of facilitates and how those are persuasive. So that's where I'm making my intervention, with my PhD research and now with this book project that I'm working on, because I think it is a valuable angle that gives people more tools and more of a sense for how their phones are acting on them, so then they can, make their own decisions. So giving the agency back to the user, back to the audience, as opposed to it being, this top-down transmission model of your phone is telling you this, so you believe this, and that's the end of
Yeah. And I think even just personally speaking for myself, trying to go back to this modality, like I try continually to turn my smartphone back into a tool, right? Where I'm looking at it as like, it's the calculator, it's, these limited sets of apps, remove all the apps, delete all the accounts associated with apps that are not conducive to being a tool to kind of further my life in some way. Well, as we get to the end of this discussion here, Shannon, I mean, we've gone into a whole lot. Do you have anything that you would want to leave the audience with regards to, I suppose, rhetoric, the smartphone, besides all the numerous things that we've discussed? Is there anywhere that we can follow a little bit more of your work?
Yeah, so in terms of following my work, since books in academia take years to come out, if at all, so we will not talk about that anymore. But I do have a couple articles in my Twitter and my Blue Sky. I have shared some thoughts about specific types of smartphone rhetoric for a general audience, and then also my dissertation, which is available online talks about it in more rhetorical, theoretical detail. And in terms of the takeaway, I mean, I've said the same things over and over, but just being aware of the different types of persuasion that are at work in everyday life, both, phones and just generally, right? Being aware and questioning why things are designed the way they are, why they have the effect they do on, on you is really, really important, because it's only in that kind of personal investigation that you can make changes, right? Because we can't question or change what we're not aware of. So that's what's been driving my project for the last many, many years. And I hope that it will continue to drive it as I get more knowledge, more research in the future.
Amazing. Amazing. Well, thank you again so much, Shannon, for taking your time to share. I'm so glad that we had a chance to discuss and to get you onto the program to talk about some of your ideas, because I feel like it's just been something I'm like, I need to get Shannon onto the program to talk about some ideas, and maybe we'll catch up and dive maybe deeper into some other topics, because we have mutual interest in literature and philosophy, and ultimately I think just trying to find meaning and directing our lives in ways that feel fulfilling and wholesome. So thank you so much, Shannon. And for the listeners here, please do subscribe to the podcast on all available channels and leave a review, comment. It does help to surface the podcast and the show to other folks on these platforms. And we will catch up with you next time. Thank you so much, Shannon.
Thank you, Robert.